Today we begin a 5-week sermon series focused on our congregation's strategic goals. For a number of years now, we've said that we seek to be a congregation that's characterized by inspiring worship, extraordinary hospitality, dynamic faith development, compassionate mission and service, and extravagant generosity. For some of you, these basic themes have become familiar, perhaps so familiar that they've lost their oomph by now. But for some of us, including Pastor Misty and me, these themes are still relatively fresh and waiting to be explored. So if nothing else, this sermon series will help your pastors catch up to the rest of you, things that you've been thinking about and trying to practice. It seems especially good that I get to preach on inspiring worship, since I have been called up to serve as your pastor of worship. So this could be an excellent opportunity for me to figure out exactly what I'm supposed to be doing around here. And I would note that while it's possible to worship God individually, this morning I will be talking about the corporate worship that we do together as a congregation. Worship is a pretty large topic, and there are so many resources that could be mined, including the descriptions of and teachings about worship in both the Old and the New Testaments. In fact, there's a whole book of worship resources in the Bible called the Psalms. Then there are thousands of years of church history and rich ecclesiastical traditions, not to mention volumes of reflections written by learned theologians and other Christian thinkers seeking to define worship and the meaning of various practices. But with all these resources available, naturally, as I began reflecting on the topic of inspiring worship, what popped into my head was a 1970s classic rock and roll song by the group Boston called More Than a Feeling, in which the group pines over a lost love named Mary Ann. Sorry, I can't always explain how my mind works. But where I'm going with this is that we all have things that we equate with inspiring worship. For some of us, inspiring worship is a warm or happy or fuzzy or exhilarating feeling. We evaluate worship by how it makes us feel. For others, it's a challenged and stimulated mind. We evaluate worship based on how it makes us think. For still others, it's the quality of the music and the other components of worship. We evaluate worship by the quality of the performance. And my central point this morning is that while each of these things can contribute to meaningful and inspiring worship, worship is more than a feeling. It's more than an intellectual exercise, more than a performance. So I'd like to reflect on these three areas a bit, and then work at defining the more than that makes Christian worship worship. So first, more than a feeling. I love worship services that make me feel good. And when I get to greet you after the service at the door, I usually can tell when we've had a good one. You're smiling and you have energy and you say nice things about me and about the music and about the service. And you feel good and that makes me feel good, and all is well in the world. Boy, when everybody feels that way, we surely must have worshiped. Except, I've been to concerts, sacred and secular, that create similar euphoric feelings. The music lifts my spirit and I feel good, but I haven't worshiped. I've been to exhilarating sporting events and have been inspired by great performances on the field and on the court, but even when my team pulls off a thrilling come-from-behind last-second victory, I haven't worshiped. I've seen the musical Les Miserables 3 times live, ranging from my kids' high school musical to a major production on a rotating stage in London's theater district. I was inspired every time by the beautiful music and what I consider to be a thoroughly Christian theme of redemption. I hummed and sang those songs for days, maybe even weeks afterwards. But it wasn't worship. Worship is more than a feeling. Another problem with defining worship solely by how it makes us feel is that our definitions often don't include a wide enough range of emotions. In our modern context, particularly contemporary worship settings, we tend to equate praise with worship, so much so that praise and worship almost gets pronounced as a single word. Yet in the Bible's hymnal, in amongst the praise psalms, we also find more reflective psalms of repentance and even lament. Old Testament worship, at least, evidently included a wider range of emotion than just happy praise. And I think the same should be true of our worship. We need to leave room for an occasional minor key. Maybe sometimes we should leave worship in a reflective mood, or a repentant mood, or even a troubled mood. We shouldn't always leave happy. And perhaps I'll have a good chance today of accomplishing that goal. Inspiring worship does touch our emotions and affects the way that we feel. But worship is more than a feeling. Now, some of us are more thinkers than feelers, and we judge a worship service more by how it makes us think than how it makes us feel. Emotion is easily manipulated and is not to be trusted, you know. What matters is the theological meat that is served, and we value eloquence, well-crafted sermons, and theological sophistication from the pulpit. We revel in orders of worship that flow logically and tie together thematically. We believe we have worship when our minds have been stimulated, when we have thought about something we don't remember thinking about before in quite that same way. And I agree that worship should feed the mind and challenge our thinking. But thinking, even about spiritual things, isn't necessarily worship. When I read a theological book, my mind is stimulated, but I haven't worshiped. I attended a lecture by the conservative Washington Post columnist George Will the other month up at Messiah College. And he was a fascinating speaker, and he made me think. And I agreed with some of what he said and disagreed with some of what he said, but I liked all of his funny stories about baseball and politics. But it was a stimulating evening. But even though I was thinking while seated in the Calvin and Janet High Center for Worship and Performing Arts at a Christian college, I didn't worship. So while I am in favor of thought-provoking sermons and worship services that feed the mind, worship is more than an intellectual exercise. So it's more than a feeling, and it's more than an intellectual exercise. Thirdly, it's more than a performance. Now, I don't know about you, but I prefer worship services where preachers demonstrate some facility with the English language and have relatively few annoying and distracting habits, where scripture readers don't stumble over words, where instrumentalists play the right notes and singers sing the right pitches, and both singers and instrumentalists demonstrate a high level of musicality. I'm in favor of all that. I like things done well, regardless of the style. I appreciate excellence, and I am inspired by gifted musicians and preachers. And I know that some of you are attracted to this church by the quality of the worship, especially the quality of the music. But there's a fine line between seeking quality and excellence in our worship and performing. And while preachers and others are not immune from the temptation to perform in worship settings, I think it's easiest for musicians to slip into a performance mentality. And I really don't know how exactly to define the difference between leading in worship and performing. But I do know that I have seen extremely talented musicians who sing and play in such a way that points beyond themselves to something or someone greater. And I have also seen musicians who perform in such a way that all I can see is them. And the same is surely true of preachers. There was a time when brethren were so wary of pride and vanity that we forbade all instruments and special music from our services. For most of our first 200 years, in fact, brethren worship included only a cappella congregational singing, sung to familiar tunes that were started by an aging deacon who struck a tuning fork against the bench to get the pitch. Now, over time, we grudgingly accepted choirs, although at first we called them choruses, which seemed less grandiose than choirs. Choruses and choirs brought pianos and organs and soon led to quartets and finally solos, which once were thought of as the ultimate display of pride and vanity. And then in the later wave of innovation, we added praise bands with electric guitars and drums and singers holding individual microphones like rock stars. I believe our worship is enhanced by instruments, choirs, soloists, and praise teams. But the old brethren weren't all wrong about the dangers of performance in worship. Professionalism and excellence certainly can contribute to inspiring and meaningful worship, but the quality of the performance doesn't necessarily produce inspiring worship, because worship is more than a performance. So what is this more than that incorporates but goes beyond our feelings, our intellect, and our gifts and talents to produce genuine and inspiring worship? What prevents our worship from being reduced to mere emotionalism or intellectualism or performance? Well, I thought about that and I came up with some words, all of which start with P, that help clarify things for me, and hopefully it will for you as well. The words are person, posture, and purpose. Now, I probably don't need to say this, but I will. The starting point for worship is the person to whom it is directed. And that person is not you, and it's not me. It is God. Preacher and writer John Piper suggests worship is what we were created for. This is the final end of all existence, the worship of God. God created the universe so that it would display the worth of His glory, and He created us so that we would see this glory and reflect it by knowing and loving it with all our heart and soul and mind and strength. Someone has observed that arguably the first 4 of the 10 commandments all relate to worship. No other gods, no bowing down to idols, no taking the name of the Lord in vain, and remembering the Sabbath with its emphasis on worship. In John chapter 4, Jesus was talking with the woman at the well about the debate Jews and Samaritans had over the proper place to worship. And Jesus said that the place wasn't what mattered, but the hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father seeks such as these to worship Him. God is spirit, Jesus said, and those who worship Him must worship in spirit and truth. God desires our spirited and genuine worship. And then toward the end of His amazing vision in Revelation 22, John is so overwhelmed that he falls down in worship at the feet of the angel who has been unveiling the future to him. But the angel immediately rebuked John and said, "You must not do that. I am just a fellow servant. Worship God. Worship God." I came across a parody video that I liked, and I'd play it for you if we had a projector here, but we don't, so let me tell you about it. It spoofs one of those old TV commercials that try to sell you a greatest hits album. And this one is advertising an album of Christian songs entitled, "It's All About Me." All 20 songs, all about you, the tongue-in-cheek voiceover announcer proclaims. And the ad features this lounge lizard-style singer at the piano singing lines from rewritten self-centered versions of various contemporary songs and traditional hymns, beginning with, "It's all about me, Jesus," and then moving on to, "I exalt me," and "Now I lift my name on high," and "There is none like me," and then concluding with rousing renditions of the Christmas chorus, "Oh, come, let us adore me," a version of which we sang this morning, and the classic hymn, "How great I am, how great I am." This amazing collection is great to share with friends if you have any, says the announcer. Everybody can join in the worship with you, for you, and about you. Now, obviously, the video is a bit ridiculous, but I think maybe sometimes we do need a reminder that worship isn't really about us. When we're tempted to think that worship is primarily about my emotions or intellectual stimulation, when we are tempted to think that worship is about a quality performance that caters to my tastes and preferences, the first corrective to that is to remember the person that we worship. Our worship services have an audience of one. We worship God. The second word is posture. Now, if you're like me, when you think of worship, you think of the specific things that we do in worship, like singing and praying and giving and reading scripture and preaching. That's worship. But in April 2019 Christianity Today article titled "Worship God at All Times, If Necessary, Use Music," author Daniel Block argues that in the Bible, worship is mostly about posture rather than praying or praising or other specific acts. He observes that both the main Hebrew word for worship in the Old Testament and the main Greek word for worship in the New refer to a physical gesture of prostration out of respect and homage before a superior. Other words like kneeling and bowing down often are added, such as when the wise men found Jesus in Bethlehem. It says they fell down and prostrated themselves before him. They worshiped him. So when the Bible talks about worship, it talks about a particular posture that conveys a particular attitude of humility. Worship is partly about seeing ourselves in proper perspective. And if it's true that the biblical meaning of worship is to bow down or even to lie on the floor in recognition of God's greatness, how odd would it be for us to draw attention to ourselves in a worship service and get puffed up over the greatness of our fine performance? The second P is posture. It's a posture of submission and humility before a God who is far greater than us and truly worthy of our worship. The third P is purpose. While worship is primarily directed toward God and focused on what we do for God, I think it also has a purpose for us. And this is where the Romans 12, 1-2 text that Ken read for us comes in. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. What stood out to me about this text as I read it this time was how it links worship with renewed minds and transformed lives. We're to present our bodies as living sacrifices in a spiritual act of worship. We worship God, but then it says, don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of our minds. That says, though our worship is directed toward God, it has the power to change us. I came across an anonymous reflection on a website called webofcreation.com that talked about the power of worship to transform our lives. And the writer observed, it's in the gathered community of worship that we celebrate our life together and affirm our identity as children of God and followers of Jesus. Worship is the place where we can be transformed anew each week. And then the writer provided some analogies to explain how worship helps reorient us so that we can see things in proper perspective. The writer said worship is like being lost in the woods and then stopping to orientate ourselves to the directions by means of a compass and then finding our way home. It's like being lost at sea and then stopping to locate ourselves from the stars in the sky so that we know where we really are and then returning to solid ground. It's like using a GPS to know just where we are in relation to everything else and then being moved to the right position. Worship is a matter of getting or keeping our bearings and being situated in our rightful place in the universe. The third P is purpose. We don't come together here to be entertained or to earn brownie points from God. We're here to be changed. Our worship, though it is directed at God, is intended to change us. Methodist Bishop Robert Schnason, in his book, 5 Practices of Fruitful Congregations, a little book that our 5 goals actually were adapted from, he sums up, comprehending the meaning for worship requires looking beyond what people do to see with the eyes of faith what God does. God uses worship to transform lives, heal wounded souls, renew hope, shape decisions, provoke change, inspire compassion, and bind people to 3 P's: person, posture, and purpose. But I have a bonus P for you as well this morning: presence. And this is a short point. We've made some lofty claims about how worship can transform our lives, but the fact of the matter is that worship can't change your life one bit if you don't participate. You have to show up. Hebrews 10:24 and 25, and let us consider how to provoke one another to love and good deeds, not neglecting to meet together as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. Now, how am I going to provoke you? Or how are we going to provoke each other to love and good deeds if we don't come together? Maybe we should try to keep our perfect attendance streak going just a little bit longer into the year, if we can. I hope that we have many services this coming year that touch our emotions. I hope we'll have some sermons that are thought-provoking and intellectually stimulating. I hope that we will continue to pursue excellence in our music and in all that we do. But I hope we'll do more than that. I hope that we'll engage in worship services that are focused on God and that renew our minds and transform our lives so that our thinking and our acting is conformed less and less to the patterns of this world. And I hope that as we humble ourselves before God, our worship will enable us to think more like Jesus and live more like Jesus. That would be inspiring worship indeed.